Hi everyone. Today we will be presenting Jason Russell, who's working with us on today's training. We have this training about secure environments in childcare centers because of the recent events that took place in the UK, horrific events that obviously posed the question, how do we make sure that our childcare centers are secure? I know that you have quite the background in the security region, and your wife is owner of 6 childcare centers herself as well. But no matter how much I talk about how great you are, I probably won't do you any justice. So would you be okay to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for taking some time today to talk about safety and security. As was said, my background is all safety and security. Spent most of my career as a U.S. Secret Service agent. Uh, Doing safety and security for world leaders, national special security events for the majority of my career. And as was said, my wife owns 6 childcare centers, and I've worked with a little over 1,000 childcare centers across the U.S. and across the world related to safety and security. So, what we're going to talk about today is really process, right? Some things that you can do as an owner, director, whatever your role might be in a center to make yourself safer, but also do it in a way that allows you to still operate your centers and your schools so that they're not prisons, right? So we want to try to be safe, but also figure out a way we can continue to operate and have those warm and welcoming learning environments as well. I'll go ahead and get started, and certainly, hopefully, be able to give you some good advice here. So there's a lot of reasons, truthfully, that childcare is especially. I think even here in the U.S., when we look at safety as it relates to education, it's almost all focused on kind of kindergarten through 12, actually. So traditional school. Very little focus is paid to kind of preschools or childcares, even though those kids certainly have a significant need, and the risks there are significant. One of the reasons that less attention has been paid traditionally to childcares is we haven't had significant incidents in childcares. Uh, that's a good thing, and obviously, with there have been some pretty big ones, and the one that occurred in the UK was significant and tragic. It hasn't really caught the attention of the public yet, because we just haven't had the number of incidents like in America like we have in the K-12 setting. So there are a lot of barriers that kind of stop people from preventing. The biggest one is probably expertise. A lot of times, I know this was the case in my wife's centers. She didn't really have anybody helping her, and she didn't have a safety and security background. In the United States, the police generally don't help child cares and generally don't provide any free resources. So a lot of times the owners and the directors are on their own to kind of decide what they need to do to prepare. And many times, even the licensing standards or the government standards that apply weren't really developed by people with safety and security expertise. So we see that as a significant issue. There are some barriers to preparation that we'll talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of how to approach safety in a layered approach. So not just focusing on physical security, but also making sure that the processes that we use to kind of reinforce those physical security measures are good in place and that they're easily translated to our employees. We're going to talk about some real basic stuff, best practices, and then kind of how to deal with kind of post-incident issues. Some of the barriers to preparation are, pretty universal. Childcares typically don't have massive budgets to prepare for safety and security. And usually most of the budget that is devoted to safety and security is focused on the physical security. So it's focused on controlling the entry and locks and those types of things. But the issue that we see a lot of times with that is, even though we have great physical security measures in place, the kind of the processes or the procedures that really reinforce those are missing. So an example of that might be, we have a great entry control, but everybody holds the door open for the person behind them, and nobody's really actually controlling the actual access. So we've devoted all these resources to putting that security piece in place, and then it almost immediately gets negated by human nature to hold the door open and be polite, right? So we need to really think about how we can create situations where we can reinforce those elements to make sure that they're working. Security certainly provides an inconvenience, and as we're thinking about how we're allowing our families and their children into our schools and our centers, thinking about how we can insert security, and it is going to provide some level of a barrier, right? So there it can be an inconvenience, and in many environments we've kind of accepted the inconvenience of security. If you think about airports, if you flew in airports 25 or 30 years ago, the security measures that were in place are far different than what is in place today. And the reason is because we experienced the threat, right? So we identified the fact that there is this threat, and almost every organization, every sector of our communities kind of goes through that. When schools, for instance, 30 years ago didn't have the same security measures that they have in place now. And the reason that security has been increased is because we've experienced this new threat environment. And childcares are probably the farthest behind when it comes to safety and security because we haven't had significant issues, and there aren't a lot of public funds that are devoted to safety and security. And quite frankly, the people that we count on for safety and security don't really understand the unique nature of a childcare, the young kids, the turnover in staffing. How do we translate these safety and security elements so that they can be replicated and actually increase our safety? The one thing to think about with childcare, if you're an owner or a director, is childcare security really is a differentiator. Childcare is one of the only areas where security can actually increase your business. In other words, parents make decisions on where they're going to send their kid based on how comfortable they are that that place would be able to care for their kids. So we've seen it certainly in our centers and in our client centers that the work that we have done with them, the assessments, the training, the policy and procedure planning, they're really able to leverage that to go to their potential clients and say, hey, this is the level we've gone to for safety and security. That's maybe different than the center down the street. And parents really react to that positively and want to send their kids to centers that are safe, especially nowadays. Obviously, the aesthetics of security can play a role. So we want to try to create those safe environments, but we also don't want them to look like we're walking into a prison. So that balance between safety and aesthetics is always a delicate one to kind of walk to make sure that we're not going too far. Because one of the interesting things about security is when it goes too far, people actually psychologically have the opposite feeling. So, for instance, when you walk through a metal detector, and depending on the type of environment you're going into, the idea that you have to go through a metal detector psychologically makes you think, well, maybe this is an unsafe environment, and if it wasn't, why would I have to go through a metal detector? Even though theoretically going through that metal detector is making you safer, psychologically it doesn't feel that way. So we have to really be careful of how we do our safety and security so that we're not putting too much in place that actually damages or creates that kind of negative psychological effect. Probably the biggest barrier to preparation is people just don't believe anything bad will happen to them. They don't believe anything bad will happen in their environment because we see it on the news and it's never us, right? It's always somebody else. And the unfortunate reality is, you never know when something bad could happen. So taking relevant kind of prudent steps is really the best way to prepare, not overreacting, but also kind of making sure that our preparation is gradual and appropriate. So we want to avoid kind of reaction-based preparation, which is unfortunately, what happens after a significant event. So something bad will happen, in your environment, in your country, in your region, and everybody will focus really heavily on, oh my gosh, we got to make sure that we do something to prepare for this. The unfortunate reality about that way of preparing is you often are chasing whatever that emergency was, right? So you're really responding to what, as if your emergency would look just like the big one that just happened. And when we do that, often we overreact. We spend money in areas that probably don't necessarily make sense. We skip steps. We rush and make kind of rash decisions. There's a lot of pressure put on for, especially from families, and a lot of times even vendors coming in and saying, oh my gosh, you need to buy this camera, you need to buy this, whatever it is. We tend to focus very heavily on physical security when we're kind of reacting, and we fall prey to marketing. I respond to emergencies in education all over the world, and after every significant event that I assist with, we see vendors really pressing on particular pieces of technology or physical security aimed at even those people that have just experienced an emergency. The other thing about preparation is, because you likely don't have a background in it, you don't really know what choice is the right choice and what choice is the wrong choice. So you suffer by this kind of paralysis by analysis, where it's like, there's so many things that I could do. What should I do? Right. So we're going to try to get you at least started on steps you can take to at least start down that path with some level of confidence that, okay, this is the right process to follow. And that's really what we want in threat-based preparation. Everything should really start with an assessment, which is, what are our threats, right? What do we currently have in place in terms of physical security, policies, procedures, training and equipment, technology, all those things? Are there any gaps? And the gaps might not necessarily even be physical security. They might be, oh, we have this great entry control, but our issue is the way we use it, right? We don't use it like an access control. We use it like a doorbell, right? We let everybody in. There's no process that gets followed. Or parents piggyback other parents in the door. Or we leave doors propped open when we take the trash out. Or we have so much turnover that nobody knows what our emergency procedures are because they've never been trained on them. So it's important to kind of start with that. That's like your diagnosis. When you think about when you get sick, you don't go directly to a pharmacy and get medication. You go to the doctor first. The doctor says, here's what's wrong. Here's what will fix what's wrong. And then you go to the pharmacy to kind of to get that treatment, right? Security is really the same way. You always have to start with kind of, okay, what are our areas that we need to improve on? What are our risks? And your risks might be different based on where you're physically located. There's a lot of things that can impact risk. Who's around us, right? What's our physical layout? What are our policies and procedures? So starting with that kind of diagnosis is important. And then determining kind of what layers are appropriate for us, right? So we're going to talk about the layers that we recommend, which are, physical security, technology. Probably the most important layer is good process, good policy, good procedure, good planning. So we're going to talk about those. Culture. So what is the culture of our organization? We want to try to make sure that whatever we do for safety and security is respectful of that. We also want to think about our operations. How does what we do impact our ability to operate? In other words, a lot of times people will put security things in place based on fear, right? And then they realize that, man, I wish we hadn't done that, or having done that has actually created this additional barrier to our operations. It's more difficult to get parents in, or, we've created this issue. And then they tend to circumvent the security that they've just put in place, right? So we need to think about, okay, if we put this new camera system in place, okay, how does it impact our ability to operate day to day? How are we going to use it? Is it worth it? Or, do we have good processes in place for it? What do we do if somebody asks to see a recording? How long do we maintain recordings? All those things have to be considered. And then how are we going to implement those things, right? How are we going to actually operationalize whatever it is that we've done? So let's say we create a new emergency plan, right? We create new emergency procedures, or we create an evacuation procedure. Have we talked through how we're going to actually implement that procedure, right? Have we trained on it? Have we practiced it? Have we looked to see if it's even legitimate? That's how we really want to prepare. So when we think about that layered approach to safety, we're really thinking about these types of layers, right? So physical security, that's the obvious one. Locks, all those different things that you think about, your access control, your key card readers, whatever it is that you use to kind of control access, your fencing, your gates, like all of those kind of physical security measures that are designed to keep us safe. That's one layer. Your technology. So are we using access control devices? Are we using cameras? Cameras is a great example of a safety technology that people think somehow makes us safer, even though the deployment and the operational operationalization of those cameras sometimes doesn't do anything to change safety. Here's what I mean by that. If you have cameras, but nobody is watching them, they're not actually preventing anything. They're just going to record something that already did happen, right? There's not a lot of deterrent effect to cameras anymore. 30 or 40 years ago, there would have been a deterrent effect to cameras. In other words, people would say, oh, there's a camera there, I better not do that. Modern humans assume they're on camera almost at all times, especially our younger generation that is likely working in childcares. They're pretty used to technology. So the deterrent effect of cameras is limited. So really, how are we using those? Technology does play a role. So whether it's your access control, your cameras, your alert capabilities, right? Like it does play a role. So we want to make sure that we've thought through, do we have the proper technology in place? But we also want to think about how we're going to use it. Probably the biggest area where we see gaps and the area where you really need to focus is in policies and procedures, right? So how do we have emergency procedures in place that are known, right? A lot of places we'll do assessments and all over the world, and we'll see emergency books that are on the shelf. But when we actually ask people, okay, what is in that book, they don't even know, right? And especially in the childcare world, because we see turnover and we see new people coming in, the ability to take our procedures and in a very simple way translate them to people so that they could actually do the things that it says is extremely important and almost never done. It's amazing to me that somehow we think that book is going to leap off the shelf in an emergency and start to help us respond. The reality is it's not. The other area where procedures are important are just in how we operate on a day-to-day basis, right? So an example of that might be if we had an emergency, depending on the size of our center, and we have a playground, how do we communicate to the people on the playground that there's an emergency? Let's say we had, God forbid, a person with a weapon inside of our facility. How would we be able to communicate to the people on the playground so that they didn't come back inside or that they responded, right? So what is our processes and procedures for those things? And an assessment would identify, hey, you're missing this piece, or the current process that you have in place isn't realistic. We still see a lot of childcares using code words. In other words, they'll use things like it's a code red or it's a code blue or whatever it is, right? That's not within best practice anymore. We want to go away from those types of things. So unfortunately, though, many people don't know that, right? So they continue to do these things that, quite frankly, have been proven to be not safe. So kind of looking through your policies, procedures, how do we grant entry to visitors? How do we grant entry to families? Really looking at those at a very granular level to say, okay, is there any issues here that we need to address? And what we find with a lot of assessments is you don't need new stuff. You just need to use the stuff that you currently have better, right? So it's not that you need new technology. It's that you need to use the technology you already have in a way that actually benefits your safety and security. The next layer would be equipment, right? Do we have emergency supplies? So what have we thought about? Hey, if we have to evacuate, right, and we have to just run outside, depending on where we're at in the world, it may be cold outside. And in a true evacuation, we probably don't have time to put coats on kids and boots on kids, right? So we may be running outside with kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds with no coats on. Have we thought about, do we have Mylar blankets? Do we have evacuation backpacks that we could take with us that would have some equipment in them that we would need in an emergency? Have we thought about where we would even go? Have we checked with the place that we think we're going to go to see if they would be willing to, to accept us? So once again, having an assessment done can help you identify those gaps. And then have we done training? And truthfully, we have a lot of U.S. Navy SEALs that work for us. One of the sayings that the SEALs have that I love is that under stress, in emergencies, human beings do not rise to the occasion. They sink to the level of their training. And one of the things that I see as a huge missing element in almost every childcare we start to work with is training. How do we train our staff on our basic emergency procedures? How do we train them on how to respond to emergencies? And there are ways to do it that don't take a lot of time and that are easy to do, but are we training them at all? or is the person training them, does the person that's training them even know what they're doing? We see a lot of times it's like the director or somebody who's training them, but they don't even know what they're doing. So it's like the blind leading the blind. So those are the layers that you want to think about as you're kind of thinking through, okay, do we have this in place? What's our technology? What are our policies and procedures? And as I said, in our assessments, a lot of weaknesses are found kind of in that policy and procedure layer. You want to kind of get back to basics. And I'm going to show you, especially when it comes to emergency plans, kind of what we would suggest as a really basic emergency plan that I think, can be translated fairly easily, but solid policies that are translated. And what I mean by that is people know what they are. So an example of that might be, my employees should not be holding the door open for people that they don't know, right? My employees should not be letting visitors in that they haven't checked. Is this person coming to do a tour? Who are they? I can't buzz people into our center and then ask them why they're there, right? So do we have the policies in place that really can impact safety and security? We want to make sure that we're really looking through those at a very granular level. Have we done some good emergency operations planning? And as I said, I'm going to show you in just a quick second here some basic protocols that you might want to put in place that really simplify emergency response. In emergencies, people aren't going to remember 15 or 20 steps. Under stress, people are only going to remember a few things. And the more simple the things are, the more likely they are to remember them. So when we think about emergency procedures, we want to simplify them as much as possible. And I'm going to show you just in a second here kind of the 4 protocols that we recommend that you have in place for your basic emergency plan. Have we also thought about kind of what are we going to do post-emergency, right? So have we thought about how we're going to communicate internally and externally? Have we thought about how we're going to communicate with parents during an emergency? In a significant emergency, a big one, and I've responded to multiple mass shooting situations, the emergency might only be 3 or 4 minutes. In other words, the time where there's life safety issues might be less than 5 minutes. But the crisis, all of the impacts of that emergency could go on for years afterwards, right? So whether it's legal liability or, those types of things, those can go on for a long time. And they can have dramatic and long-lasting impacts on your ability to operate as an organization. So thinking about, have we thought about how we would respond post-incident, whether it's communication with parents, communication with other stakeholders, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to go back to operating the center? Have we thought about, continuity of operations, things like that? And I keep harping on processes, but having solid processes in place that are communicated to people. And so people are held to a standard. A significant example of that in childcare is what we call piggybacking. So piggybacking is basically, one person opens the door and then they hold the door open for the 15 people behind them. And we just have people coming in over and over, right? So we have to put processes in place that deal with that. And those processes probably need to start as soon as we tour a family. And what I mean by that is when we tour families and our clients tour families, we stress to them, you should start talking about your security in your tours. And here's what we do for security. An example would be, we really discourage our parents and our employees for holding doors open for anybody, right? Because we want to make sure that we're keeping a safe environment. So we would ask that, when you bring your child to the center, you don't hold the door open for other people, and other people likely won't hold the door open for you. They're not being rude. It's just a security measure that we take very seriously. People appreciate that, and they really can understand, especially nowadays, why those things are so important. But if you don't communicate that early on, if you don't communicate that with staff, and if you don't reinforce it when you see it being done wrong, then you'll start to see your security erode and erode and erode over time. And you might get away with that for a long time. You may. But you also might have somebody who decides, hey, this place is a pretty soft target, and it might be a place that I would want to target. Or maybe I'm a non-custodial parent. I'm having, domestic issues with my significant other, and I decide I'm going to follow somebody in to take my kid out of there, or I'm mad at a teacher, right? So creating those good processes, and then really thinking about how can we do some meaningful training. The two trainings that I think are critical for childcare staff. One is what we call critical incident response training. It's basically how to respond to emergencies, right? So everything from evacuation to, God forbid, an active shooter situation. So it's a broad-based emergency response training, talks about physiology, talks about brain processes. The one that we do is about 3 hours, includes some scenarios, but it's excellent kind of basic training. The other training I think is super important for childcare is de-escalation strategies, communication, right? We often see a lot of conflicts, and a lot of those conflicts can be exacerbated by poor communication strategies. So whether it's our nonverbal communication is poor, we don't know the right things to say, we don't really understand how human beings communicate, we don't understand how to control our nonverbal and our verbal communication to really impact an outcome. So if I was to say, which two trainings would you suggest for childcares, I would say some type of emergency response training, not just active shooter, but emergency response, and some type of de-escalation training. Those two are really kind of what I would call cornerstone trainings, right? They're basic, but they're really important because those things come up so often and can be used. So I wanted to talk to you about kind of those basic protocols. So when we talk about emergency response, we actually use what we call primary protocols. So the idea behind primary protocols is most emergencies actually funnel into one of the four responses that you see on your screen. So the idea is there's a million different emergencies you can face, right? And it's almost impossible to plan for every different type of emergency. But we do know that most emergencies, the vast majority, the response is going to fall into one of these four basic categories, okay? And these are the words that we use. These are pretty standard in the United States as kind of a baseline primary protocols. And, I think they're pretty easy to understand. So the first one is what we call secure mode. So secure mode is basically used in a situation that is not yet impacting us, but it's somewhere in our environment. So an example of that might be maybe there's a bank robbery at the bank down the street, or maybe there's a domestic situation across the street, or there's something in our area. It's not impacting us yet, but we just want to take some preventative steps to make sure that it can't get to us, right? So what we do in secure mode is we just secure all of our exterior access points. We keep everybody inside, and we can kind of continue normal operations. We're just not going to go outside, right? We're just kind of making sure that our perimeter is secure. We call that secure mode. We're staying secure. Lockdown is what we use when we have an imminent human threat, right? So something really bad is happening. Somebody's in our building with a weapon, or they're imminently close, and it's a dangerous human threat. We might go into what we call lockdown, which is we're getting people into safe spaces. We're making sure everybody knows that we're going into lockdown, and we're obviously, reaching out for our authorities, police, and we're getting into safe areas to try to protect kids. Okay. A lot of different reasons we could go into lockdown. Active shooter is one of them. There's a lot of different reasons you might go into that. Evacuation means our facility is no longer safe, right? Fire, chemical release, something like that. We have to get out. Okay. So this is probably the most commonly known one because you practice fire drills likely on a regular basis, but basically we can't stay here. So the things to consider with evacuation is, have we thought about where we would go if we can't come back into the building? Most places, when they do their fire drills, they just go outside for a couple minutes and then they come right back in. Well, what if it was a real, if you really had to evacuate? Have you thought about where you would go? Is there some place nearby that we could access that would be able to protect the kids, would get us far enough away from the emergency, but would provide us with a place that we could go to be safe, and maybe reunify those kids with their parents. So that would be the third one. So evacuation, building's not safe. Shelter in place is the opposite. The outside isn't safe because of an environmental or a, weather situation. So shelter in place is used for a non-human threat. It's used for environmental. So maybe there's a train that derailed and it's releasing some chemicals, or there's a weather situation that's dangerous and the outside isn't safe. So we want to stay inside. Okay. The vast majority of emergencies, other than a medical protocol, which is the other one that we use, funnel into one of those four protocols. So when we're training staff at childcare, we're not going through, okay, here's this emergency, here's this emergency, here's this emergency. They're never going to remember all that. And we have turnover constantly in childcares. So even if we did do that, in 6 months, we're going to have 10 or 15 staff members that have never been trained. So we need to think of a way we can constantly train people that allows them to know the protocols, keeps them very simple, and can be trained. And this is what we use. And we have an online version of this that's about an hour long that we put childcares through that allows them to just refresh with their staff constantly. We also have an online de-escalation strategies training. So hopefully those primary protocols are something you'll consider as a way to really simplify your emergency protocols. You may still have kind of that compliance version of the plan, which has all the details, and you should have that. But for a teacher in a classroom, really it needs to be simplified down to as simple as possible so that they can remember the information. So that we use those primary responses. Once again, training, multi-hazard training is the best. So don't just train on one emergency. In the US, active shooter training is really popular, which is understandable because we have a lot of those situations. But the reality is you're far less likely to face an active shooter than you are to face a fire or a chemical spill or a bomb threat or, a lot of other things. So we recommend multi-hazard training. You really should think about training that certainly does cover active shooter, but talks about other emergencies. We should really try to train all staff and think of ways that we can refresh that training and make sure that we have some standard. So the best way to do that is, truthfully, start off, if you can, with an in-person training, get all the staff trained to a level, and then follow that up with online training to kind of keep people refreshed. And then maybe every 2 to 3 years, do another in-person training. And then once again, go back to that kind of online methodology. This can even reduce your liability because when you have an emergency, if somebody does something wrong, you're going to be asked, what were your emergency procedures and were they trained? And if they are not, you're going to definitely have an issue. Emergency plans, the training should be customized. So in other words, it should be custom to your location. An example of that would be if I'm teaching you lockdown, right? I'm teaching you how to be safe in your classroom. I need to know which way your doors swing. I need to know how your locks work. Because if your doors swing out into the hallway, then I would for sure give you different advice than if your doors swing into the classroom. If your doors swing in, I could tell you, you know what, in a lockdown, you could barricade that door. You could put something in front of it. If your doors swing out, it doesn't do any good to barricade an outward swinging door. So the reason the assessment is a really good place to start is it allows you to really identify the weaknesses, the gaps, and hopefully be able to identify those so that when you are doing training, you say, okay, you don't have a lock on this door. So we would need to think of another way to secure this door. If I'm just training you on some basic standard without knowing your space, then I may give you incorrect information. And, the unfortunate reality is training needs to be regular. It's perishable. If you think about anything that you practiced a long time ago, for me, it was, Spanish. I don't remember almost any Spanish. The reason I don't remember it is because I didn't continue to keep up on it, right? It was a perishable skill. I don't use it regularly, and therefore I didn't retain it. Emergency response is the same thing. If we teach it one time and then we never teach it again, people are likely to forget those skills. So in emergency response, we want to make sure that we have some type of regular cadence. Certainly don't want to make this the only thing that you do, and it shouldn't be. If you're really being responsible and relevant about how you tackle this issue, it really should just take a little bit of time to get you where you need to be, and then it's maintenance, right? Then it's just a matter of keeping those things up. So, best practices start with an assessment, right? And certainly, we can certainly give you some advice on that, and certainly could help you with that if you need to. Completing that threat assessment. What are our threats? What are our risks? You want to avoid either extreme. You don't want to be complacent. You certainly don't want to do nothing. You also don't want to panic. You want to make sure that you're kind of in that middle area where you're saying, okay, we're not going to do nothing, but we're also not going to go overboard and turn this into a prison. So the best way to avoid that is to kind of do regular, kind of gradual preparation. Safety and security is definitely a differentiator, especially in childcare. Parents make a decision where they're going to send their kids based on a lot of criteria, but we've done surveys over the years, and safety is always either 1, 2, or 3 on their list. Often it's number 1. By far, if you ask people, would you rather send your kid to a safe center or a pretty center, they're going to say safe, right? You can do both, and hopefully that's what you're doing, but safety is right at the top. So, if you're doing something unique, if you're using, consultants like us or something else, you should be sharing that with your families to say, here's why we're better. Not only do we have great educational experience, we have this beautiful facility, we're also really serious on making sure that we're safe and secure. And here's what we do to make sure we're safe and secure. We've had an assessment done by former Secret Service agents. We've had training, right? And also understand that police and security are not the same. They're just not. I was a police officer long before I was a Secret Service agent. It's just not the same thing. Security is very proactive. Policing is very reactive, right? So police are the ones that respond when something bad happens. Security and the things that we want you to do are very proactive. We want you to think about ways to make yourself safe before the emergency, not during it. So those are best practices. Crisis response, we talked about that. You really want to think about how would we deal with post-incident issues, right? So who are we communicating? How are we communicating? How is it going to impact our ability to operate long-term? Having some kind of framework in place, having some kind of communication templates or something you can deploy out is super important. So that would be something you'd also want to consider. What are we doing post-incident? And then just wanted to provide you with our contact information. Once again, we work with childcares all around the world. We have consultants based, all over the place that can go out and assist childcares. It's a fairly inexpensive process to do in-person assessments and trainings. We also have online virtual assessments, virtual trainings that can kind of help you if you're unable to be able to bring somebody out. So that's my email address right there. That'll go directly to me, our office number there, as well as our website, secprotects.com. Once again, really appreciate everybody attending today. Hopefully this was helpful and gave you a little bit of good information that you can use as you continue to make your centers more safe and secure. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all that information. I think we really were able to have a big shift of mind here, because you highlighted a lot of things that were actually probably not at the top of someone's awareness before this training. So based on the things that you said, I have a couple of questions, because I think it is such a huge point, especially around the training and the frequency of trainings. As you said, training is probably one of the most critical things in security. So how do you make sure that a childcare team, is ready for an incident without scaring the staff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really the idea is the training should be tailored to childcare staff, right? So one of the problems we see with emergency response training is a lot of times it's essentially training that's designed for police that we're trying to cram into a childcare environment. And it creates a negative reaction because it's too scary. It's not on their level. It's not basic. It's actually too advanced for them. And instead of making them feel more prepared, they actually feel worse. They feel like, wow, this is really dangerous and we would never be able to deal with this. So the training has to be designed for childcare, right? So it has to be teacher friendly and designed in a way that empowers and not makes people feel more scared. And that's why we recommend kind of seeking training out with people that have worked in childcares, that know childcare, because it is different than every other environment. And then also coming up with the frequency of training. So I think a good mix, as I said, is an in-person training, maybe once every 2 or 3 years. And then in between that, you have the online trainings you can do to keep people up to speed.
Great. So one of the things you actually pointed out was that unique aspect of childcare security. And I know you gave some examples. Would you be able to provide like a specific aspect, like a real life experience of a childcare security aspect that you have encountered?
Yeah, there's really 2 that come to mind. One is access, right? So probably the most common weakness that we see in childcare is a lot of times they'll have really good technology in place to limit people's ability to get in, but anybody who shows up at the front door, they'll just buzz that person in or let the person in. In other words, they don't have any process for it. They're not asking questions. They're not observing the person. They're not checking to see, okay, kind of what are you here for, right? So they're essentially, their process is backwards. They're not checking to see who the person is before they let the person in. They're letting the person in and then checking to see why they're there. So that's probably the main one. The second one that I would say that we see most commonly as a weakness is alert capability. What I mean by that is sometimes our centers are large. So how are we spreading information quickly in an emergency so that everybody knows that the emergency is occurring, right? And most childcares don't have that solution in place. They're using, maybe they don't have anything, right? Uh, and some, for fire, obviously that one's usually solved because we have fire alarm. But for almost every other emergency, how would we be able? Let's say we had a God forbid an active shooter in our building. How would we communicate to everybody almost instantaneously that that was occurring? That's a massive weakness in childcares. And almost every facility, quite frankly, that we see hasn't really come up with a good solution for that. So we have really practical ways that we kind of assist childcares in coming up with that. One of the ways that's a very simple solution is like a boat air horn, right? So a really loud air horn that's only used for that. It's not used for any other emergency. And maybe we place those around the center in various locations and say, okay, this is our active shooter. If there's a really bad situation, we use this air horn. It's loud enough that everybody would be able to hear it, and we would be able to communicate very quickly. That's an example of kind of a very simple solution to put in place for something like that.
That's great. I was actually thinking about that when you were talking about, because if someone used, for example, walkie-talkies or something, you would give away your position, wouldn't you? So that might not be an ideal solution to that. So I was thinking, what is a simple solution to that thing? So that's a
Yeah,
great
and a lot of
example.
times, even with the two-way radios, we have nap time. So I'll see a lot of teachers will turn the radio down during its nap
Right.
time because they don't want to. So then, if they were to need it in an emergency, it might not even be loud enough for them to hear. So, even thinking about, okay, we'd use the two-way radios, but we also might want to equip people with an earpiece so during nap time they can have the radio on and listen to it, but not impact the kids being able to sleep. Those earpieces are like $3 a piece, right? Simple solution, but does allows us to continue to be able to communicate without waking kids up.
Well, you are definitely seasoned in childcare security. So that is a great input you gave us today. And I feel like um, there was definitely a big shift in some people's minds about how childcare security can impact a center, and definitely also the policies. Because what I hear from most of the clients is all around the childcare security provided by the like Ofsted, for example, or the inspections in the US. So adding that part of the security onto the childcare security provided by those institutions might be overwhelming for some of the childcare centers. So how would you respond to that, to the overwhelming aspect of security?
And I think that's hopefully where you can bring in, somebody that really helps you kind of cut through the noise and gives you a plan, right? So that's where consultants like us play a role, is to come in and say, okay, here's what we really need to do, right, to make sure that you're safe and where you need to be. Because a lot of times for an owner, it's just overwhelming, right? Like you said, there's so many things that I need to do from a compliance perspective, hand washing stations and diaper changing and all that stuff, that those overwhelm us enough that we almost never get to the security and the emergency planning stuff. So if you have the resources to do it, to bring in a consultant to say, okay, we need some help with this, and we're talking, in the U.S. for us to do an assessment and a training, talking less than $5,000. So it's not overwhelming huge costs, and the online versions are even more cost effective. So it's certainly not overwhelming, and because of the differentiator that it creates, you can actually make money from it if you get additional clients.
Exactly. So on that note, I hope that our viewers have a few minutes to just sit down and think, how secure is my center right now? And would it make sense to get that professional assessment for security? Because to me, it does look like it's a very, very active topic that is currently not getting the attention that it deserves. So, Jason, thank you very much for your training today. It was very insightful and an absolute pleasure. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye, everyone.